You may be seated. My experience with sheep, and really most livestock, is that I attended a high school that had an ag building where peers of mine would participate in FFA or 4-H, and they would prepare for fairs. I never went in the ag building. I just knew it existed towards the back of the property. So I couldn't tell you what each animal needed or how my peers tended to them, or if my peers used a metaphor to explain life, I wouldn't have understood it. So had Jesus been talking to me, when he talked of the Good Shepherd, it would likely have been lost on me. Yet being a shepherd was a familiar career to most, if not all, during Jesus' lifetime. It was also an image connected to the description of God, as well as how God was the good shepherd or the divine shepherd. And there were comparisons of what made a bad shepherd. And all throughout Hebrew scriptures, this reference continues. As the imagery that was intimate to this audience in our text today, even if they weren't shepherds themselves, they understood what it took. So while for many of us, if not all of us here, who are less familiar with the relationship between a shepherd and its sheep, it made sense to those listening to Jesus. The disciples, Pharisees, and bystanders would have known exactly what a shepherd needed to do, that it was a 24/7-hour job. They would drink the sheep's milk. They made sure they were safe and healthy. They relied on one another. And in some cases, they even were sustenance at the end of the animal's life. If they were a shepherd whose flock was going to the temple for sacrifice, the shepherd would go through the sheep gate first, never leaving the sheep until they handed them off to the temple authorities. There's a common misconception, and one that I actually held until I read about sheep this week, that sheep are unintelligent animals. And I was wrong. They are actually quite intelligent. They can recall up to 50 faces or other animals up to 2 years. Recent studies show that they can feel a variety of emotions. They are communal animals, and in some cases, they even have a best little sheep pal that they hang out with. They can be considered unintelligent because they are ones who follow. If one sheep starts moving, it's easier to move the entire flock. Their eyesight is almost 360 degrees around, which is fantastic for spotting a predator, but it doesn't have a great deal of depth perception. So the shepherds have to make sure that their path is safe, because even a basic puddle of water, if it's too deep, can harm a sheep. So while they need a shepherd, it is not because they are unintelligent. It is because they are quite vulnerable of creatures. Sheep do not do well with startling noises or yelling. They do not adapt quickly to new routes or objects. If a shepherd is moving them, they do so from the front of the herd instead of from the back like one would drive cattle. To protect, guide, and nurture sheep well, the shepherd must know its flock intimately. And in that close connection, the sheep are able to learn their shepherd's voice or regular call and know that it is safe to follow where they lead and respond. To learn the voice of one who will guide you to experience life abundantly is something we humans can too relate in our own lives, and we can acknowledge that it's not always easy. Sheep come to trust their shepherds and follow their voices because the shepherds have proven to be trustworthy. The sheep know that they will risk if they wander off to come and find them. They know that they will take care and do what is best for the flock and to keep them safe all along the way, never leaving them. Shepherds can be alone in this work in the fields, but often journey with other shepherds or other flocks, or accompanied by hired hands, as our text today notes. The hired hands were those who would assist with the flock, but did not do much beyond that. Hired hands are the ones who wouldn't risk the well-being of the flock. In fact, they would sometimes push the flock too hard to get to a new place in quicker time. The shepherd was the one to know the speed and pace of its flock. In my studies this week, I realized that sheep might be stubborn, but they do not need a shepherd because they don't know how to think for themselves, but rather they are incredibly vulnerable to harm. And if left on their own, they can die. So often I hear this story of the Good Shepherd as being one focusing on Jesus as the Good Shepherd because he was crucified, which is absolutely true. Yet there are so many dynamic ways that Jesus was the Good Shepherd before the crucifixion and post-resurrection that often don't get noted. Jesus knew all he met by name, learned how to teach his disciples in such a way that they could receive what he was teaching and saying. He would risk what was deemed correct or well approved by the temple for the well-being of whoever was in front of him. All of those experiences of Jesus is what caused this monologue that is our text today. Here's what was taking place before our text picks up. Jesus was outside the gate on a Sabbath, and he and his disciples came upon a man who had been blind since birth. So the disciples questioned Jesus and said, "Was it this man's sin or the sin of his father and mother who made him blind from birth?" Jesus ignores the premise entirely of their question and says, "It is because God's work is to be revealed through this man." Jesus didn't speak to this man, to the disciples about this man. Jesus looked at this man, engaged this man. You see, he bent down and spat on the ground and made a mud mask, and he put it on this man's eyes and then told him to go wash in the pool of Siloam. When the man returned, he had sight and had new life. Those who had only known him as the blind beggar questioned how this could be. Some even went to the Pharisees asking them how this could be. In typical Pharisee Jesus doctrine examinations, the Pharisees asked those who were present how this man received his sight. As they heard these accounts, they placed themselves in a dilemma because some of the Pharisees were saying, "Surely this man is of God, because who else could heal a man who had been blind since birth?" While others were saying, "How can this man be in relationship with God and practice such a thing on the Sabbath?" In their questioning of the man with sight, the Pharisees got frustrated and annoyed with how this man continued to challenge their beliefs of how this could be so. And so, after a while, they got frustrated and finally said to him, "You were born entirely in sin, and yet you are trying to teach us?" Then the Pharisees drove him out of the temple. Jesus hears this and goes to the man, and upon finding him, asks him if he believes in the Son of Man. And he says, "Lord, I believe." Then Jesus says to him that he came into the world for judgment so that those who do not see may have sight, and that those who see may be blind. Upon hearing this, nearby Pharisees say, "Surely we are not the ones who are blind, are we?" And Jesus said, "If you were blind, you would not have sinned. But now that you say we see, you remain in your sin." Then, without any interruptions or pauses, Jesus begins discussing the Good Shepherd and the hired hands. He is likely making reference to the Pharisees when referencing the hired hands, since they are ones to care for the people but not risk their beliefs or practices for the health and well-being of those in front of them. The blindness Jesus is discussing here is that the Pharisees are so certain in their doctrine that they are adamant that they know how the law must be obeyed and observed. So much so that their absolution of this has made them blind to the point that they can't see salvation, justice, or grace when it is right in front of them, and instead they choose doctrinal obedience. where in this story we have a man who had been blind and been restored to sight by Jesus, and he can't explain it based off of Jewish doctrine, and yet he professes that even though he cannot understand it, he believes. He believes because he has life abundantly, no longer on the outskirts of society, merely begging for scraps. But Jesus freed him to move about society for the first time, freely, knowing he could be fully welcomed. Jesus saw the man in need, dismissed that sin had caused his blindness, ignores Sabbath law to heal him, and reveals to the man who had been unseen, almost so much so that it matched his own blindness, that Jesus had seen him and Jesus knows him. And in doing so reveals that he has been and will forever be the good shepherd. This discourse with the Pharisees takes place shortly before all the texts preparing for the crucifixion and resurrection. Here we are with this reading during Eastertide and know the stories following Jesus' resurrection and how he was equipping the disciples to carry on. An exchange that passes on the shepherding to the disciples happens between Jesus and Peter post-resurrection. This is when Jesus and Peter go back and forth 3 times, Jesus asking Peter if he loves him, and Peter saying, "Yes, Lord, you know I do." And Jesus responds, "Then feed my sheep." With us following the good shepherd and carrying on the charge to feed Jesus' sheep, we become shepherds just as much as we are called to be God's sheep. Knowing that we are not the good shepherd ourselves, but called to care for God's flock, we are in the beautiful both and of discipleship. We are continually learning from Jesus' life and teachings and those who have led us well in this life around us, while we also seek to be leading and guiding and caring for all in Christ's flock. At times it can feel like there's either to be a sheep or to be a shepherd, but truly we are both sheep and shepherds throughout our lives. We are able to be shepherds because we have been loved so fully and known completely by God that we can share the light and wisdom with all we meet. This means we make the effort to get to know one another authentically, knowing how to care for one another the way they need to be cared for, allowing them to know they have been seen and heard. This does not come easily in our society because we often care for others the way we want to be cared for, and we don't take time to talk, make space, slow down, and learn what other people need. And on the flip side of that, if somebody does come to you and ask you, what do you need in these times? Sometimes we don't trust that they're going to respect what we say or even remember it, and at worst, not keep it confidential. So we don't authentically share with others who ask us what we need. This can make us susceptible in believing others want the same thing we do, and so we generalize that others feel like we do, even though we have not asked the vulnerable questions to know that as fact. Many of you can relate to this experience of people responding in generalizations. Key folks who probably have experienced this are parents or teachers. Both know that you can't care for one child the way you care for another. And when a student feels like they are not being cared for well, they sometimes turn to the generalizations of, well, the class feels this way. Or if you have multiple children, all of us kids really don't like this. So they don't get to have to go to that personal space in self to say, I don't like this or I feel this way, and tapping into their emotions and vulnerability. It's easier, whether we do it consciously or unconsciously, to go to the general terms than getting to know the individual. So as shepherds, we are called to be in meaningful relationships, learning what those in the fold of God need, and sharing as we can so that they know they have been seen and known well. As shepherds of God's flock of sheep, we are called to welcome all, no matter how comfortable or uncomfortable that may be at times. Being a congregation of radical welcome means we know that we will get it wrong at times. Not because we mean to, but because welcoming is hard. But here's the difference of being a community of radical welcome. When we get it wrong, we will name it, we will learn from it, and move forward so that we don't unwelcome anyone else ever again. And through it, we will live in the tension that comes with welcoming all of God's beloveds. Tension because the process is slow to welcome another person fully. Yet we want to find a quick response or solution because we think tension is negative, makes us uncomfortable. We like things to be calm and easy and know that we are on a good path. Yet if we look to Jesus, most of his ministry was filled with tension and slow understandings. There was tension when one disciple would get what Jesus was saying and then struggle to understand why the other disciples weren't catching on. And so Jesus lived in that tension until everybody was on board. Tension in Jesus reminding his disciples and the Pharisees that all are welcome to eat at his table, wash his feet, and share life abundantly with him. There should always be tension in radical welcome because we are continuing to learn how to welcome all. And in doing so, we explore why it's hard for us to welcome some and easy to welcome others. This radical welcome is one that God orchestrates. As Psalm 23 says, even though I walk through the valley of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. Radical welcome is one where we can be in the presence of our enemies and be safe, for God is bringing us into this space together. It is a welcome that creates in us newness of love and grace. Welcome should always challenge us because it should always cause us to grow. We live in tension when we welcome and do not expect others to assimilate to how we believe, worship, or serve. And that can be a difficult practice because it means we have to put the collective good above our individual preferences. We can live in these tensions because Jesus already journeyed through them. And as our good shepherd, he continues to journey with us in our tensions today. As we live into this radical welcome of the gospel, let us remember that there are others who hear God's voice and are not part of this flock as we know it to be, yet are still in the fold of God. This means we do not have to concern ourselves with who is in the flock and who is not. Our focus is simply on inviting people to experience God's radical welcome and then actively open ourselves to welcome them into this particular expression of God's flock that we call Calvary. Calvary, you are a remarkably welcoming congregation. It is something we hear back regularly from guests and new attenders. It is a community of welcome. Continue this, grow in this, always assessing how we can be more welcoming as our community grows with new people. This is also an individual journey within our collective experience at Calvary, a journey of awareness, and here's how we can begin to explore some of those ways of assessing how we as individuals experience God's radical welcome as part of our discipleship journey. If you aren't sure how to open yourself up more to God's radical welcome, think of somebody in your life who does this consistently and at least looks like they do it easily. Have coffee with them, have a meal with them. Ask them how they have found this presence of welcome to be where they root and ground themselves. Learn from them. Their welcome will be extended to you for sure. If you're somebody who welcomes but notices that you then expect people to believe as you do, worship how you like, or participate in the way you think they should, I invite you to explore the awareness of implicit bias and learn where those biases come from in you. not working to adjust them just yet or to have judgment around them, but to acknowledge we all have biases, and sometimes they come in to how we worship. If you're somebody who welcomes openly and freely, continue this work, and then ask yourself this: do you let others welcome you just as you welcome them? Do they know you well? Or are you able to let them care for you? Or is the care a one-directional relationship? If it is a one-directional relationship, explore why you feel uneasy about allowing others to care for you and know you. For you see, we are all invited to be God's sheep and God's shepherds as we continue to grow in Jesus' wisdom as the Good Shepherd. We never arrive or achieve this journey, for when we believe we have arrived, we become spiritually blind, just as the Pharisees. When we learn we can never know God fully and can live into the mystery of God and allow ourselves to freely explore faith, our sight becomes even brighter than before. It is one of those things that allow us to know that we are shepherds. And in doing so, we can be entrusted with God's flock. And as dedicated shepherds, we are able to live lives that allow all to be welcomed into this space. Being a shepherd can be nice. We see those gentle pictures of Jesus with the sheep, and we don't realize that being a shepherd is full of muck and dirt and grime. But that's what it is to follow Jesus. No matter who is on the margins of our society, they are at the center of the gospel, and we get to be part of that. So as we continue to welcome as a community, ask yourselves, are you shepherds or are you sheep? And may the answer be both. For the shepherds among us are all of us if we respond to God's invitation to do so. Amen.